I did Twister, I was pretty confident, and I felt like I was doing some cool stuff. So
yeah, fear normally motivates you to do great things, or it completely takes you in the other direction. And
yes,
on the note of speed, I have to tell you. I mean, I know you know this, but I'm just telling you this. To this day, that theme, dun 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 dun,
yeah,
and the movie itself hasn't aged at all. At all. It is such a fantastic action film with such a great concept. And I watched the trailer recently, just to kind of see how the trailer was done, and it makes it look like one of the things I noticed was Jeff Daniels' role was like, huge, even though we know what happens to his character,
right.
And it's such a great film, and that one scene that never leaves my mind is which I'm pretty sure a lot of people, the baby stroller. When
Oh,
the
yeah.
bus hit the baby
Oh,
stroller,
yeah.
and it just your heart in your mouth, and
Yeah.
even now it's gonna happen, I still cringe like what is that? But
yes, I love that, and I I have a 21-year-old daughter, so when she was about 16, I showed her Speed, and I hadn't seen it forever, and yeah, I felt the same way. I felt like, man, this really holds up. It's really fun. I love the elevator sequence. To start that movie with that whole elevator thing is so anti the bus, right? It's a still thing. It's thing that's stuck, whereas the bus is going. So it's like, it was such a great way to start the movie.
Yeah. And
yeah.
Mark, how did you before? Let's go back a little bit before Speed. You were working with Hans. How did you work on his team or in his office or whatever that was? How did you make that transition into the score world in Hans Zimmer's world?
Well, what happened? So I was. I had a little studio in my house, very small. And I was always, as I told you, since I was 12, I was writing songs. So I always had material. I still have CDs full of my music recorded in garages with bands. And I have all of it. It's amazing I still have it. But by that time, I was, writing for myself as an artist. And I had an LA producer. His name is John Van Tongeren, and his buddy was a fellow named Jay Rifkin, and Jay was an engineer, and Jay came over to mix my music, and he liked it, and he was impressed with it, and he said, "Have you ever written any instrumental music?" Well, yes, because I was doing documentaries, so I had a lot of instrumental music, and I had one particular demo that I did that was really quite strong. I think it was one of my better demos. And he said, "Could I have it?" And so I gave it to Jay, but I didn't know that Jay was partners with Hans Zimmer. And I didn't even know who Hans Zimmer was. So when he said he was partners with him, I was like, I don't know. I thought he was talking about the composer that wrote Miami Vice, but that's a different person. Next thing, I got a phone call from Hans, and he said, bring your equipment to my studio. So I just had I could fit it in my trunk, and I had an old Buick, and I drove up to his place in Santa Monica and unloaded my stuff and set up. And I think it was Billy Idol coming in, and Billy and I worked on a song for Days of Thunder. I think that's where it started. And then, and then Hans would ask me to do commercials or ask me to work on a series or ask me, and I would do some of it at my house, and then I would sometimes bring my stuff in and do it at his place. Eventually, I worked on a movie called True Romance.
Yes.
And True Romance is kind of what turned on Jan de Bont. He heard some cues from that and thought they were really cool, and those were my cues. So I think that's kind of helped Jan with Speed.
Got it.
But you see, at the same time, I had a parallel career. I was also producing and writing songs for other artists. So I had written a song for Yes, and I co-produced that. And then I wrote a song for Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and I moved to England and produced their entire album for a year and a half. So I kind of had the scoring thing going and the song producing thing going. So it only seemed natural that one of the first big breaks besides Speed was The Lion King. because the first movie, Hans asked me to do the songs. He asked me to arrange and produce, because the songs weren't sounding African. They were Elton songs, and they didn't really have a lot to do with an African feeling.
Right.
And Hans felt that I could do that because he had listened to other stuff that I did. So Speed and Lion King came out around the same time.
Yeah.
So that was a good jumping off point, you know.
Yes, and I mean, 80s was a great era for films, and 70s and 60s. 80s was the beginning, in my view, and please tell me if I'm wrong because you're the expert. 80s was the era of maybe slowly the very beginning of musical scores kind of coming into play, like Back to the Future, E.T., you know, John Williams stuff. But 90s, you know, especially with the film like The Rock, Speed, Twister, The Lion King, the scores became like that's how I got into scores. Like I think the album that got me into scores was Last of Mohicans.
Oh yeah, Trevor Jones, right?
Yeah. To this day, I listen to that, 1492, Twister, Speed, The Rock, Tarzan, which you also did. You know, there's some great soundtracks, and I think that 90s era built a very strong fan base for score lovers. Would you say that's something that you witnessed too?
Well, I would say that, see, I think that scores, let's just go back to, you know, 50s, 60s, you know, scores were really based a lot more on jazz, which was the more of a flavor of earlier times. And when you get into the 60s and all the rock music, when they would do a rock score, it was never good. You know, it just didn't work so that never worked. And I think then in the 70s, especially with John Williams, he realized, you know, a great theme transcends the movie. I mean, you walk out of the theater singing the theme. So that was the 70s and all of that. And then I think what happened is technology kind of made it so that guys like me and guys like Hans, who were song guys, score guys, but song guys, and had come from a pop world, could kind of transfer into kind of a score world with thematic music that's memorable and accessible. And it wasn't really based on, you know, it wasn't rock music and it wasn't jazz.